Hey, what's up guys? In today's video, I want to talk about why I use serverless functions for pretty much everything that I build, especially when I'm working on something like a startup or some small project that I want to deploy and get up and running quickly. I'll talk about two different architecture styles and why using a serverless function setup is definitely a lot better, especially if you're like a startup or you want to build fast. So I would say 90% of companies have a setup like this where they have some application on some CDN that hosts all of their front-end code, and they have APIs that are set up on their own servers. In this case, I have a DigitalOcean server. And for this kind of server setup, you'll have some initial costs and as well as some ongoing costs. You'll have to set up all of the security and firewall configuration, like on the actual machine itself. You'll also have to deploy the code to the machine. So like all of the API code that you want to actually host, you have to bring it down and actually deploy this here, which it in itself also is kind of a process, because if you don't want to SSH into the machine and actually deploy it manually every time, you would want to set up some kind of CI/CD pipeline. Also, you have to make sure to install the correct dependencies and make sure that they don't conflict on your actual machine. And you'll actually have to run and manage those code processes. And also you have to have an Nginx config or some kind of reverse proxy to actually serve requests that are coming in from your application, from your actual React application or whatever is hosted on your CDN. And this is just the initial setup. If you go over to the ongoing setup, you see that there's a bunch of server management, like you have to update the OS, if there's any security patches as well. And when you do something like that, you have to actually bring the machine down. So that means that any new machine updates, you have to have some kind of downtime unless you configure it in such a way where you have, like, let's say a separate machine or a separate server that will host your application while you're actually deploying your new updates on your original server. Also, you have to do any manual fixes on the machine. So if the machine goes down for any reason at all, you actually have to do like the maintenance on that server. And this doesn't sound too bad when you only have one server, but when you have multiple of these, you have like, you know, up to 10 different servers. Doing these manual fixes can get really crazy, especially when one server goes down, but then the other ones are fine. Very hard to debug exactly why certain things happen on certain servers and why it's not happening on the other. And once you have lots of users, you have to actually do manual scaling. So that way you can actually serve all the requests that are coming in from your front end. You have to either do vertical scaling where you make this box bigger, so you pretty much increase the actual capacity of the box. Or if you do horizontal scaling, you'll have pretty much more instances of this server. But then you have to actually, you know, configure this and have maybe a load balancer here and kind of balance the load across all of the different servers. Maybe you can also look into using Kubernetes as well to manage kind of like a swarm of servers. And pretty much this just becomes really, really messy and really quick, especially when you're wanting to work on something that's like kind of small, or if you want to move fast for your startup, this becomes a really big burden. So if we go over the pros and cons, so if you look at the pros, you have full control of pretty much everything on the machine. So you have your OS, you have your runtime, and you have your environment. You can pretty much do anything that you want. You can install any applications onto the machine. You can install any processes, run any, you know, cron jobs if you need to. So pretty much you have full control of the actual application server itself. Also, a really nice thing is that you don't have cold starts. So pretty much you'll have low latency. This is an issue with serverless setups where it takes around like 500 milliseconds in the worst case, where the machine shuts down, stays off for some time. But in this kind of setup, you won't have that because you'll always have your DigitalOcean or your server setup pretty much running constantly. Also, if you want to run long running processes on your machine, you won't get any timeouts. So if you use like a serverless setup, let's say Netlify functions or AWS functions, you'll have some execution timeout around 10 to 30 seconds. And sometimes you need something that's longer, especially when you're doing, let's say, an OpenAI request, which will take potentially up to 1 minute to give you a response. So if you're doing anything that's needing like a long-term running process, you may want to opt for this server setup because you can actually perform that on this. And you have no vendor lock-in, so you don't have to worry about AWS Lambda functions or the Netlify functions restricting some kind of capability onto your actual machine. In this case, you can do anything you want on the machine. Even if it's hosted on DigitalOcean, you still have access to all of the resources on this box. So the pros are pretty nice, but I think the biggest con, and I think this is why people usually opt for serverless setups, is that you have to do manual scaling. And scaling is a big issue even across large companies like, let's say, Amazon, Microsoft, Google. So you trying to do that at a small scale is going to be really difficult, especially when you don't have the resources to actually put into, you know, hiring people to actually do that kind of scaling, or even just paying for the scaling cost itself. Another thing is that you will be paying for idle time. So this is a con because this machine will be running no matter what. If this machine is like, let's say $35, you always have to pay that amount no matter the kind of traffic on your application. As well as there's a big maintenance overhead. So pretty much you're the one who's on call pretty much 24/7. And especially if you're just a single person working on your startup, you can only, stay up for 16 hours. You have to sleep at some time. So, and something startups really value is deploying things fast and deploying features and getting them in front of users. And that's something that's really difficult to do because you'll need to think about what happens when I actually deploy this new feature onto my new servers. And so this is kind of the setup for a normal server setup, but you can also go with the serverless approach. So you have the same kind of setup where you have your React application, or let's say some kind of front-end code that's deployed on some CDN, and you go ahead and just call out to your different functions that act as your backend. For the initial setup, you just have some serverless function handler, and you just fill in the request and the response for that handler itself, and you just push the code to the repo, and pretty much that's it. You don't have to do any other setup. You don't have to worry about the actual runtime or the OS or really anything. All of that is like abstracted away from you. And for ongoing costs, you really don't have to do any server management because the provider that you're using, Netlify, Vercel, or AWS, they do all of the management for the service itself for you. This means that you don't have any downtime when you actually deploy code, and you don't need to worry about manual scaling. And some of the biggest benefits is that your provider does all the heavy lifting on the more complicated aspects of your application. And also a nice added benefit is that you pay per execution. So this server is not actually running 24/7. It only spins up when your requests come in from your front end. So you can just like have this run whenever you need to, and you're not paying for something that doesn't have that many users or doesn't have that many requests coming to it. And this lets you develop features super fast because in this initial setup, this will take probably 5 minutes, and you don't really have to do anything with this ongoing setup. So you just write the code once, deploy it, and then that's it. You can just worry about your application actually working. Now, if we look at some of the cons, you do have cold starts, which is about like 500 milliseconds or less. You could have some cold start when your application actually runs for the first time. This function is actually not running or doesn't have any runtime set up or really anything set up until the first request comes in from your application. There are some ways to mitigate this by always keeping your functions hot by actually hitting them with some requests periodically. And also there's max timeouts for these functions, so they can only run for a certain period of time until they actually shut down. So if you need to do something like, let's say, some long running process and you're calling out to some AI to actually get some answer, that AI may take up to 1 minute. So you may need to actually use a server to provide that long running process. There's also more complex debugging because you don't actually have access to this machine. This is all abstracted away from you, and you pretty much have less control overall on what is actually going on onto this server. So you can have Netlify actually wrapping your requests and doing something special in the background, which could be messing up like your request and response from your React application. And you can't really do anything about it. You have to really work around the infrastructure of your provider here. Seeing all the pros and benefits of serverless and servered architectures, what do I think is the best and why do I usually opt for serverless architectures? I think this is best used if you are focused on speed, especially for startup, because they want rapid iteration and they are focusing on growth. So you want to actually get out those features faster in front of the user's eyes. And as long as you're okay with having cold starts and you're not running any long running processes, then this is definitely the way to go, especially because there's so much more speed and you don't have to worry about having issues, especially when it comes to scaling, where scaling is a whole beast in itself. For server architectures, a lot of bigger businesses can afford to be slower. They have more people and more resources to actually put onto their application and make sure that everything's working as expected. That said, if you do have some long running jobs, you may want to opt for using a server architecture, since you can actually perform those jobs and respond back to your clients easily. Or if you're doing something that's really compute intensive and you need high performance, then you can beef up like one machine to have really high performance and you don't have to worry about like latency on that actual machine. So yeah, that's a little bit about why I usually use serverless, especially when I'm building out smaller projects or starting up something where I really want to get features in front of users. Let me know what you guys think about serverless versus servered architectures. Do you guys usually use serverless? Do you like it? Let me know in the comment section below, and I'll see you guys in the next one.